And welcome into this edition of Quarantine Q&A. It is presented by Alabama One Credit Union. They've been voted Tuscaloosa's best credit union and best mortgage lender. Alabama One offers low-rate auto, mortgage, and business loans, plus protection for it all with Alabama One Insurance. You can visit any of their 9 local branches or check them out online at alabama1.org. Alabama One, a proud supporter of Crimson Tide Athletics. This is Roger Hoover, glad to welcome you back to the Crimson Tide Sports Network. And over the course of the last few months, we've had a lot of interesting discussions on Quarantine Q&A, really all inside the University of Alabama family. Today, we go outside the University of Alabama family for the first time as we go to the Buckeye State and welcome in the voice of Ohio State football and men's basketball, Paul Keels, who joins us from Ohio. And Paul, it's great to talk to you. Of course, everybody's excited about what's coming up way down the road, 2027, 2028, when Alabama and Ohio State meet once again. But how are you?
I'm doing good, Roger. Nice to talk to you.
Certainly glad to catch up over this next little bit, and it's a growing trend in college football. We're starting to see more home-and-home series as opposed to neutral site matchups, and while it is 7 years away from the first time that Alabama and Ohio State are scheduled to play, I'm sure the reaction from Ohio State fans was similar to what we had in Tuscaloosa. A lot of excitement for this upcoming series.
Absolutely, and I've got to say the first person I heard from after it was announced was Eli Gold, and Eli and I, whenever we get to see one another, which is rare, but we always joke about how it just seems to be so infrequently that we do come across one another. But it was a great thing, and it really kind of has come about in an unusual time because, as you said, Roger, everybody's trying to beef up their non-conference schedule. Ohio State last year was minus a premier Power 5 non-conference opponent because TV intervened with what was supposed to be a home-and-home with TCU, and they made it a couple of years ago a one-off game in Arlington, Texas, so it left Ohio State without a premier non-conference opponent last year, other than, I would say, the University of Cincinnati. But it was a great thing to have happen, and especially a great thing that it's going to be games played in Columbus and in Tuscaloosa.
Yeah, so many people love the on-campus experience, and Alabama and Ohio State last met in the Sugar Bowl in 2015, and now to have the Crimson Tide come to Columbus, to have the Buckeyes come to Tuscaloosa, just what do you feel like the fan bases will really be excited for the most when they do get to see the other team's traditions?
Probably most excited to see about trying to get tickets to go to a game like that. When you put two big names together like that, certainly it's going to draw a lot of national attention, but it'll make for exciting opportunities for all of the folks around Columbus and the surrounding areas with whatever they do regarding promotions, things like that. If we assume that everything will be normal on campuses by then, certainly I think it's going to make for great tailgating atmosphere. But just the fact that you get two powerhouses like this to meet on the field, it can go a long way to helping the winner of this game, or these two games, be able to make a big step forward to a national championship. But also, it certainly is one of those that the loser of the game, it won't completely eliminate him, you wouldn't think, because it will have the stock that it does with playing an opponent like an Ohio State or an Alabama and being able to give them an opportunity to recover very possibly if the game doesn't go the way they want.
And not only Ohio State taking on Alabama in the future, but also Georgia's been announced, Notre Dame. So again, Ohio State seems to be falling in line with all the Power 5 schools and really a lot of the traditional powers trying to schedule marquee games like this, and that has to get you excited.
It certainly does, and I think you throw in Oregon, which starts this year with Ohio State supposedly going to Oregon to play there. Notre Dame comes on, Texas. So, and there's also been a commitment, when possible, for Ohio State to play in-state opponents. Last year they had Cincinnati. This coming year they've got Bowling Green. So it's an important thing to be able to keep some of that revenue within the state of Ohio as well, but also to be able to get as many home games as they can, much like I'm sure for Alabama. Ohio State, with the revenue that comes from football, that helps from a financial standpoint to support the 36 sports that they sponsor. So it really is one of those things, and it's good to see that everybody is now following suit. It's not just a few schools, but folks are really trying to do what it is they can to beef up their non-conference schedule. It certainly makes for great TV opportunities and desirable games for the TV networks to put on. But, I think it also is a good thing for the fans that spend the money for these tickets. As we know, these tickets are not cheap. So when you've got the opportunity to buy season tickets and somewhere down the way you're going to see an Alabama or you're going to see a Georgia, that's got to be a nice carrot for fans.
Certainly looking forward to it. It's coming up 2027 in Columbus, 2028 in Tuscaloosa, and that was announced just a few weeks ago by both Ohio State and Alabama. Paul, as we shift gears a little bit, I wanted to ask you about how things are going in Columbus. It seemed like early in the COVID-19 pandemic, Ohio was really one of the early hot spots and was one of the first states to really take some steps to try and flatten the curve. But how have things been going over the last few weeks?
Well, last few weeks, as things have opened up, you've seen some return to somewhat of normalcy. But, Roger, really the big step that Governor Mike DeWine took, and he got initially a lot of flack for it, but there's a yearly bodybuilding competition that comes to Columbus, sponsored by Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's called the Arnold Classic, and it brings people from all around the world. And Mike DeWine made the decision to cancel that. I believe it was late February, early March, whenever that event occurs, and got a lot of grief for it. But when you think about how things eventually turned out, it probably helped keep things in the state of Ohio from being worse than they were. But as bars and restaurants and other places have started to open up, the zoo is opening up here in the near future. Nursing homes now are going to be able to have visitors on a limited basis. It's been a good thing, I think, probably, Roger, for people's mentality more than anything else. Still, you can see if you go into grocery stores and you go into a lot of places, people are wearing masks. The restaurants have really implemented the social distancing either by eliminating some of the tables or seats or putting up plexiglass to try and separate folks. So Ohio is kind of starting to make the crawl back to somewhat of normalcy, and certainly the state government, while maybe some people feel they've done some things that they shouldn't or maybe haven't done enough, by and large, the state government has done a very good job here.
As a lot of campuses are starting to return to activity with athletes coming back for voluntary workouts, there have been some instances where there have been some positive tests for COVID-19. Has there really been any news like that coming out of Ohio State with its football program?
None that we know of, Roger, and Ohio State is pretty good by keeping things close to the vest and not releasing a lot of stuff. But what they've done, like everybody else, athletes going back in waves, doing the temperature checks and everything as they've gone in. They've limited where in their facility they can go to. The coaching staff has kind of gone in waves too. So nothing that we know of, but again, Ohio State's pretty good about keeping a lot of that with the health and information laws, keeping things, not really releasing a lot of that to the public. So nothing in regard to specific individuals or a number of them that we've heard as we talk today.
Expectations are always high for a program like Alabama, like Ohio State, but I imagine trying to get back to the playoff, trying to win the Big Ten once again has got to be priority for Ryan Day. Just what kind of team does he have coming back this year? Well,
and a lot of those expectations, Roger, as you can imagine, are fueled by the fact that you have a returning quarterback. And the way Justin Fields played in his first year last year, the way he improved as the season went on, that has a lot to do with the excitement. Now, while Ohio State lost a lot of people, especially a record-setting running back in J.K. Dobbins and an outstanding group of wide receivers, there are others that are ready to kind of step in and help fill the bill. Getting Trey Sermon as a graduate transfer at running back is going to be big for Ohio State, especially considering the fact that they've got a couple of running backs that are dealing with some injury in Marcus Crowley and Master Teague. They lose some outstanding receivers, but a guy like Chris Olave has really been a big influence the last couple of years. Garrett Wilson, who will be a sophomore, showed the ability to be a game changer. And the offensive line brings, they had their losses there, losing the 2 starters and 3 players that played a lot, but a lot of their linchpins are coming back there. Defensively, there's a lot of excitement about what they bring back, even losing an outstanding player like Chase Young. Part of what's helped them be so good defensively is the constant rotation of people on the defensive line. They've got some big holes to fill in the secondary, losing both starting cornerbacks and a starting safety. But the biggest addition they made probably on that side of the ball was getting Kerry Combs back on the coaching staff. He'll take care of the defensive secondary. It's his second stint here as Ohio State's defensive backs coach. He's a native Ohioan from Cincinnati, an outstanding recruiter. So those are a lot of the things that have really encouraged people and created those expectations for Ohio State this year.
And speaking of expectations, we may have had a preview of the upcoming Heisman race coming up between Justin Fields of Ohio State and Trevor Lawrence of Clemson when they met in the Fiesta Bowl this past year. But for Fields, what makes him such a dynamic player, and how does Ohio State use him creatively in its offense?
I think, Roger, what makes him so dangerous is that he's a multi-threat quarterback, passing and running. He's a guy that even at his size, when he does get the opportunity to run the football, he can really break plays and go the distance in a blink of an eye, really. His passing was outstanding, again, taking advantage of the multiple receiving threats he had, including the tight end group, which has some depth returning this year. And the offensive line really played at a high level, so that really aided to what Justin Fields was able to do. But a lot of that also ties to Ryan Day. Prior to being the head coach, he was the quarterback's coach here. He had great success working with J.T. Barrett and with Dwayne Haskins before Justin got here. So I think all of those things have been factors, as well as a defense that really made it difficult on opponents. But all of those were factors in what helped Justin Fields have the success, as well as his own outstanding natural ability.
Yeah, you mentioned Ryan Day. How has he transitioned to the role of head coach? How did you see him grow over the past year?
Well, what really helped Ryan Day in his growth, Roger, was in 2018 when he served as acting head coach for 3 games when Urban Meyer was suspended. Ryan really handled that as well as anybody could have. And he'll be the first to tell you that he was aided in part that he had 2 former head coaches on his staff, Kevin Wilson, who had been a head coach at Indiana, and Greg Schiano, who's now back at Rutgers. But Ryan Day is a guy that, because of his personality, his outgoing ability to really connect with people, the simplest way to put it, he's just such a good guy. And that has helped him with recruiting. I think that's helped him with connecting with players, connecting with the media, and really was able, with the help of his other assistants, to continue what was going on under Urban Meyer with recruiting and their execution on the field. Also the fact that, and this doesn't get talked about enough, Roger, when you think about the hires that Ryan Day made when he became, the permanent head coach, he brought Jeff Hafley in, who's now the head coach at Boston College, brought Greg Madison and Al Washington in, who had been in Michigan. Those were great upgrades on the defensive side of the ball. Keeping Larry Johnson as the defensive line coach just continued the excellence that's gone on in that position group. And then really turning things over on the offensive side, even though while he was still so involved in all of the play calling, but having a quarterback's coach like Mike Yursich, who's now been gone, but Brian Hartline at receiver, and Greg Studrawa, who's done an outstanding job with the offensive line. Ryan Day's really, maybe one of his big calling cards was the decisions that he made on the coaching staff when he took over.
You mentioned a moment ago the schedule is highlighted by a trip to Oregon this year. The Big Ten schedule is always tough for Ohio State, but what are you looking forward to the most about this upcoming season as it relates to the schedule?
Well, first off, just getting the season started with the way that everything's gone now. That's probably, Roger, something that everybody's looking forward to. But the Oregon game certainly is going to be a highlight game going out there. And there's a lot of great prospects for what the Ducks might be able to do this year. This will be the first time they've met one another since the national championship game following their win over Alabama. But there's also a road game at Penn State, and that's never an easy place to play. Generally, that game has always been, or seemingly has always been, a night game. But now with what Fox has done with putting prime games at 12 noon, if Fox is able to get that game, and those of us that have to work those things who really like the 12 noon games, but that's going to be a big point for what Ohio State has to be able to do. And then the Michigan game, that's always very special. As you can imagine, knowing what a rivalry is like the Iron Bowl down there, it's kind of a season all unto itself. But the Oregon game, the Penn State game, and Michigan, those are really kind of the high points that really have a lot of people excited about what 2020 could be.
There's always a talk about the SEC with the SEC network giving every school equal shares of money that has helped the parity a lot in the conference. The Big Ten, of course, was first with the Big Ten network many years ago, and it seems like the parity is continuing to rise in the Big Ten as well. Is that what you have seen?
I think it's kept some parity in the upper part of it, Roger. There's still some folks that are kind of dragging behind. Rutgers and Maryland really have not been able to add, for the most part, to the competitive part of what goes on now. The unfortunate part for those two schools, they're in a loaded Big Ten East division with Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State. On the West, Wisconsin has really been the standard bearer, although we saw Minnesota have an outstanding season last year. Kind of came up short toward the end to be able to win the division. And Iowa's one of those that the minute you ignore Iowa, they jump up and have a phenomenal year. Nebraska hasn't been able to maybe bring it up like everybody thought they would when they first came into the conference. There's always the anticipation that they'll be able to. But I think certainly what the Big Ten Network has done, probably more than anything, has helped with some of the exposure with the Olympic sports. They've done an outstanding job with what they do with football and with basketball and some of their featured programming, but they've really given some good exposure to the Olympic sports. They've done a great job with some of their documentary-type programming. And so that's one of the things. And, I know that when the Big Ten Network first got started, they were one of the early, I believe the Mountain West was the first league to have their own network. It was called the Mountain at that time. I don't even know, Roger, if it still exists anymore. But, much like the SEC network, it's a great tool for the conferences, not only to be able to showcase what goes on athletically, but academically, and just some of the other things that go on within the institutions.
Well, during the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, with sports being shut down, we've all had a chance to kind of take a deep breath and really celebrate the history of our respective programs. For instance, the Crimson Tide Sports Network has been airing classic games from the Nick Saban era on every Saturday. Have you had a chance to kind of take a step back and look back on some of your fond memories of Ohio State football and your tenure as the announcer? And what have you guys been doing to celebrate the legacy of Ohio State football?
Well, Roger, what we've done in our network, and it's something usually we do every summer, but don't start it until late July or early August. But what our folks did, and our executive producer, Skip Mossick, did a great job of putting together replaying games from last season. And that started, maybe late May. So every Saturday, they're replaying games in order from 2019. And this past Saturday, they played the Michigan game. This coming Saturday, they'll air the Wisconsin game from the Big Ten Championship, and then eventually air the playoff game against Clemson. And leading up to what will be the start of the season, they'll go back and replay some other games from even previous to 2019. We've also started to put together some things with during my 23 years of some of the more memorable games for both football and basketball, to be able to put some packages together and do some things like that. In our area here, there's still a lot of excitement about hockey because the NHL's Columbus Blue Jackets will be part of the NHL's return to play with a postseason. They'll qualify and be in one of the early, I think they're calling it play-in rounds or something like that, where they'll face the Toronto Maple Leafs. Also around here, the basketball tournament, which involves some of the former college athletes, is going to be staged here in Columbus at Nationwide Arena, obviously without fans. But there's an Ohio State alumni team called Carmen's Crew, based on the fight song. And they won the basketball tournament last year. It features such great names like Aaron Kraft, David Lighting, William Buford, so many of them who played at Ohio State. So that's kind of helped get everybody a little excited about the potential return of sports around here. But, we all know, much like I'm sure you know down there, Roger, it's while all of those things are great and exciting, the biggest question that occurs is what's going to go on with Ohio State football.
Yeah, that certainly is the main topic of conversation, and still many more questions to be had as we continue getting closer to September. But, Paul, just having Alabama, Ohio State, the future series for 2027, 2028 has given a lot of Alabama fans some excitement. I know the same can be said for Buckeye fans at Columbus, but just thank you for your time over the last few minutes to talk about these two great schools getting to meet down the road, and also what the Ohio State football season hopefully will look like for the Buckeyes. Just thank you for your time.
My pleasure, and my best to Chris Stewart and to Eli Gold, two folks I've known for a long time. Best wishes to them also, Roger.
Absolutely, two of the best in the business. And speaking of the best in the business, we had one of them with us just now, Paul Keels, the voice of the Ohio State Buckeyes. We thank him for joining us for Quarantine Q&A here on the Crimson Tide Sports Network.